Hello everyone, welcome back to A Working Man's Guide. Thank you for joining me. In our first series, we covered the national debt. I hope you found that useful, informative, and I hope it drives your vote. That's my intent here, is to change your view of public policy so that we actually make public policy that benefits the public. That's the whole point. Not any particular group, but the public as a whole. We're going to make a change here. We're going to change topics. I hope you'll enjoy this one as much as you did the last one. It's actually related. You'll remember a piece of our focus in the national debt was sound money. That's something that we must have. And that's what I'm going to focus on now in this next series. Sound money and some key things we need to get that. We need to face the truth. The Federal Reserve has failed us. They are not doing their job. They're wrapped up in partisan politics. They are not serving the American public. They are serving themselves, and it's a travesty. It's costing us a great deal. We need to set that right. We need that institution to perform, to do its job, and that will greatly benefit the American public. So I'm going to break that down. I'm going to give you details, give you information, and I hope I change your vote. Let's jump right into our new series on the Federal Reserve. What we want to discuss here is the whole idea of sound money. See, in these modern times, we must have a sound currency. That is a public good. It is basic infrastructure that a government should be expected to provide. And there are two aspects to sound money. One is it has to be very difficult to counterfeit. And on that regard, our government does a very good job. I'll give you details in this book, A Working Man's Guide, Chapter 7. You'll see charts and quotes, etc. But the counterfeit rates against the US dollar they're very low. Our government has succeeded. That happens through basically the US Mint as a part of the US Treasury, and they print the money, and also the Secret Service. They do the investigations to prevent counterfeit, and they do a very good job. It's very solid from that standpoint. You see, for a currency to provide value to a country, it has to be convenient. It has to be something we can use with ease, that facilitates transactions, and that facilitates commerce, and we build wealth in that context. So if it's easy to counterfeit, then it can be faked and it becomes worthless. So that's the first requirement. The second requirement for sound money is it must have stable purchasing power over time. In other words, the value of a dollar in the marketplace today needs to be very similar to what it was a year ago, 2 years ago, a year from now, etc. That facilitates commerce. When that varies, that goes up and down, that creates uncertainty, it creates disparities in wealth, it creates many problems in your society. And that must be addressed, and that's what we're going to focus on. Let's go back into the notion of stable purchasing power. That's a critical component. The way you look at that is to look at a price index, basically a measure of inflation. Do similar cost of goods, does it stay the same over time, or does it increase through price increases? We have a very good measurement of consumer and producer price indexes that we use today. Let's take a look at those, and we'll get a good sense of where we stand and what's been happening in our country. So here we have a time series from 1914 to February of 2024 in this chart. And this is also a figure 16 in my book, A Working Man's Guide. You can find that in the appendix, figure 16. It lays out the data, and you can source that. But first of all, let's look at an overview, and let's start with the good news. You can see back in the early 1900s, we had a great deal of volatility. In fact, over quite a bit of time, even through the 1980s, a lot of volatility. The overall story here is that we are getting better. Our money is more stable. If you look at this center line, around 0.0, that means there is 0% inflation. Prices are flat year over year. That's a very good thing. That should be your policy target. That's what you want. No change in general prices from one time period to the next. That means we can focus on value. The dollar in your pocket has similar purchasing power today as what it did a year ago, etc. And we are getting better. That's the good news. Things are getting more stable over time. So we're improving, but we have a long ways to go. Just look at this point out here on the far right. That's not good. So here's our line at 0. That means no inflation. Our currency is stable. Well, as we commented overall, we are getting better over time. Now let me point out the policy aspects to this. So you see these spikes and these dips along the way. We could dig into each one of those. Those are policy and event related. And oftentimes only policy or bad policy responses to events. There's a story behind each one of these. It would take us a very long time to break that down, but there are human events and there are governmental policies that drive that. I want to bring our attention to this most recent period here. This spike in 2020, 2021, through and then starting to come down in 2023 and 2024. That is directly related to policy. I want to focus on the expense of that. This spike right here, ladies and gentlemen, is what sent the Biden administration out of office. That was the number one reason. This spike and the subsequent decrease in household incomes that resulted from that. That's the number one reason. The second reason was crime. The third reason was the border. Those were the top 3 reasons. This is number 1 right here. People do vote their pocketbook as they should. We're going to break that down in terms of cost and opportunity. The policy implications you see here are a direct responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Their scope is bigger than stable purchasing power and sound money, but that's right at the heart of it. That's why they exist. Now, we look at what happened in recent times here. You see this spike. We got up to just under 10% annual inflation. Let's remind ourselves what that did to incomes. Give me a second here. We look at this chart, annual household income, as we did in the last series. You see this dip to the right. That was precipitated first by the COVID event, the COVID-19 virus, and the response to it, the economic lockdowns, and then the disastrous 21 fiscal spending packages that gave us the inflation we saw in the prior chart that drove these incomes through the floor. There was a major impact. Now, when we come back next time, I'm going to scope out a rough estimate of cost, what that cost us. The main point here is when we get policy wrong, it's expensive. It goes right to the citizen, right to the taxpayer. We need to demand better of our public institutions. So as we've seen prior episodes, this drop in incomes was driven by the COVID event, policies around it, and inflation, which is a direct responsibility of the Federal Reserve to prevent. Well, let's look at some cost here. So the cost of bad public policy, let's start with that. This drop in its total cost was driven by 3 things: the COVID event itself, the virus, the response to it in terms of the lockdowns, and then the spending packages in 2021, which sparked inflation and kept these incomes down. Those are terrible policies, all 3 of them. We now know that the virus itself was released through Wuhan, China, funded by your NIH, National Institute of Health, Anthony Fauci. And then the response to that, the lockdowns, very controversial, not effective, did not prevent the disease. Huge economic cost associated with that and social cost. And then you have the inflation, which tax on top of that. So we had a series of 3 steps, very disastrous public policies. You can estimate the cost of that. You see this trend in the income line. That did not have to drop. That could have continued on. If you project this up, you get a adjusted household income of around 87,000 is what it should have been in 2022. And I'm using the price index available at the time. So you've got a cost per household in the $11,000 range. If you assume 85, 90 million households effective, you're up around $1 trillion in expense. And that's a single point in time in 2022. You have to sum up the area of this triangle here. You're well north of $1 trillion in terms of cost. That's the bill that was handed to us by our elected officials and unelected officials. We need to take that seriously, we need to hold them accountable, and we need to demand better. As we look at household incomes here, we can create this triangle. What happened due to bad public policy, where we would have been without that? You put a value on that triangle right there, you get to $1 trillion really fast. And I think that is understated. That's a point in time as of the last point. You have to sum it up. That does not include the social costs, keeping kids out of school, the developmental costs. That does not include the loss in innovation, productivity, the thousands of bankruptcies that took place out of that. Bad public policy is very expensive. Now that takes us to where we are today. As we stand here today and we look back on this, we need to learn a few things. We need to take a few things to heart. And there's one thing in particular around the Federal Reserve. Their entire mission is to give us sound money. Well, you have this spectacle in 2021 of Janet Yellen, the then Secretary of the Treasury, and Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, championing these spending packages. They knew full well what that was going to cost. These are Ivy League trained economists. They have PhDs in the field of economics. They know full well the cause of inflation, what brings it about. We need to address that. We have a public institution that has not done its job. We need to face up to that. We need to make a change. Let's look at the underlying problems some more and get to solutions. So let's continue squarely with stable purchasing power and the role of the Federal Reserve. They have failed us. There's no better way to say it. There's no more honest and accurate way to say it than that. The Federal Reserve has not done its job. They've been playing what can be called a wizard behind the curtain routine. They're back in the dark corners, pulling levers, coming up with what they think should be interest rate policy. Nobody knows what they do. Nobody's aware of how they set it. But we're supposed to just trust them. Well, we shouldn't. They're not trustworthy. They've created one disaster right after another. It's time for reform. If you look at Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, you look at Jerome Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, they were openly championing the fiscal spending packages in 2021, knowing full well what those would cause. Those are Ivy League trained economists. They knew the impact. They did it anyway. So we need reform. We need institutional reform. We need an institution much like the Federal Reserve that is wholly devoted to sound money. That's a necessary public good. It is basic infrastructure. We need reform in that institution. There are essentially 4 things that need to happen at the Federal Reserve in order to make it function as it should. What are the reforms that we need at the Federal Reserve in order to make it function as it should on behalf of the American public? They need to step out of the wizard behind the curtain routine. They need to stop providing cover for bad public policy. They need to do their jobs. What are the things that need to happen? There are 4 in particular. The first one is an operational review. At every meeting of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, they should conduct a full operational review of the fiscal status of the United States and fully disclose that in public to every American. All metrics, all comparisons over time show us everything that they're looking at. They owe us that. They don't do that. They don't provide that. Much of it is behind the scenes, and we get some indication of what they might do. That's a ridiculous process, and it should change right away. That's the first step immediately that should be taken, a full operational review open to the public. The second thing is a third-party independent audit. Between 1 and 4 times per year, the Federal Reserve should be fully audited by independent, nonpartisan agents, and to prove what they do, to prove out the accuracy and the fullness of the information that they use and the decisions they make based upon that data. That's the second step. The third step, a rules-based approach to interest rate policy. This is where the wizard behind the curtain routine needs to be imploded entirely and never returned to. There is no reason for this to be some kind of mystery. The Fed should simply be seeking what is an open market, a market-determined interest rate given current conditions, something that happens in markets around the world all the time. It should be an open process with many participants. That is possible for the Federal Reserve to create that. We have the data, we have the data sciences, we have the knowledge, we can create the processes for that to happen. It can be open, it can be transparent. Now I want you to imagine for a moment if we have that instead of the process we have today, which is a smoke and mirrors routine. When there is a debate in Congress on fiscal policy, you can draw a straight line from proposed actions to inflation and interest rate. Think if that wouldn't have mattered in 2021. It would have made all the difference. If the debate would have been, do we want to spark inflation to near 10% and raise interest rates dramatically and drop household incomes, what would have happened to those spending packages in 2021? They would have gone down in flames, as they should have. We can create an environment where that kind of tie between fiscal policy and proposals and interest rate inflation impacts is direct and known by all involved. That's quite possible. The Federal Reserve knows that. They have failed to do it. We need to hold them accountable, make them do their jobs. The fourth one is the Federal Reserve needs to commit itself to advocating for sound fiscal policy. Now, no doubt that rests in the hands of the Congress and the administration, but there is no way you can have sound money. There is no way you can have stable purchasing power without sound fiscal policy, sound spending by the feds. And they've been playing political games by not being honest about that. This is where the Federal Reserve, most of all, has failed us. They will choose which political party they want to lean toward for whatever interests they have, rather than doing what is best for the public. But the truth is, there is a direct tie between sound fiscal policy, federal spending, and sound money, stable purchasing power. You can't divorce the two. The Fed should be openly committed in a nonpartisan way to advocating, creating and advocating sound fiscal policies. The first one, above all, a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We need to bake into law fiscal sanity, fiscal responsibility. The Federal Reserve should be a part of that. They should openly advocate for those type policies. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, 4 solutions that would bring the Federal Reserve back to its basic duties and provide basic infrastructure to the American public. Thank you very much. Take care.